Coming up on the Civil Discourse, Anthony Kronman discusses his work in law, philosophy, education, and theology. Professor Kronman is a former dean of Yale Law School and the author of numerous books, including Education's End: Why Our Colleges and Universities Have Given Up on the Meaning of Life.
What is the place in a democratic society like ours of institutions devoted to cultivation, refinement, and the advancement of the human spirit, to the ideal of excellence in all of its various domains and dimensions?
Hello and welcome to the Civil Discourse. I'm your host, Paula Morantz-Cohn, Dean of the Pennoni Honors College and Professor of English at Drexel University, speaking to you from my home in Center City, Philadelphia. Today my guest is philosopher and legal scholar Anthony T. Kronman. Professor Kronman is the former dean of the Yale Law School and the author of many books, including The Assault on American Excellence, A Critique of Higher Education, and most recently, After Disbelief, on Disenchantment, Disappointment, Eternity, and Joy, a record of his spiritual journey. Anthony Kronman, welcome to the Civil Discourse.
Thank you, Paul. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm delighted to have you. You grew up in LA, where your parents were part of the film industry, and of course we tend to think of LA as a rather superficial sort of place. And yet you developed into a very serious intellectual, which is more associated with the Puritan Northeast, where you live now. I wonder where you got your intellectual beginnings. I mean, how do you account for the way you think?
Well, I had a wonderfully out-of-doors boyhood growing up in Southern California and paid very little attention to matters of the mind or the spirit, with one critical exception. My mother, who had never been to college, was a born thinker, a born philosopher, I would say. And we spent endless hours when I was a little boy sitting on the front steps of our home in Santa Monica, California, talking about all manner of things. And she said to me, you know, we can only see a few of the stars that exist, and beyond those there are more, and beyond those there are more. And I said, well, where does it all end? And she said, it doesn't end. And I found that a startling thought. And I said, who studies such things? And she looked at me, I think she had a martini in her hand, and she said, well, that's a question they call a metaphysical question, and metaphysicians study it. And at some level in my 7-year-old soul, I think I resolved to be a metaphysician.
I think it's very interesting, isn't it, how we can remember these nodal points in our childhood that seem to carry so much weight for our intellectual development.
Yes, well, and I remember vividly my mother saying to me at about the same time, if I had a book, I would always have a friend and never be alone. And she had a lifelong passion for reading, which she passed on to me very early on in my life. It's interesting to me in reflection, thinking back on all of this. My father, who was college educated, had been to the University of Cincinnati and to the Hebrew Union College, where he became an ordained rabbi, was not much of a reader. And not, I would say, a devoted intellectual in the way my mother was, who really had very little by way of formal education.
So you began your academic career studying philosophy, but then you turned to law after you went to Yale and you completed your PhD in philosophy. Was that a practical turn, or was that really a fascination with the law, or some combination of both?
It certainly grew into the latter, into a fascination with the law for its own sake. But it began as an interest in bringing down to earth and making more concretely manageable some of the philosophical questions that I'd been wrestling with as a graduate student during my 4 years in the PhD program at Yale. As a philosopher, as a student of philosophy, I was mainly interested in social and political thought. And many of the figures I read and studied had themselves been deeply interested in legal institutions and the history of legal philosophy. And so, in a way, my going to law school was a natural continuation of the work I'd done as a philosophy student. But after I arrived and got my bearings and adjusted to the very different culture climate of the law school environment, I began pretty quickly to acquire a passion for the law for its own sake and to take delight in the doctrinal puzzles and predicaments that the law deals with. And during really the whole of my teaching career, I've tried to keep one foot in each camp. I love being able to go back and forth from one to the other, and I would feel profoundly disappointed if I were told that I could only do one of the two going forward.
You write in your books about the fact that you went through a Marxist phase while you were in college. I believe in graduate school you began to move away from that way of thinking, which may have also inspired your turn toward law and perhaps understanding the legal mechanism of things as they function in this country in a practical way. I think it's interesting that you said that when you were dean of Yale Law School, you wanted to move against or dilute some of the theoretical thinking that had predominated at the law school and perhaps at law schools in general throughout this country. Was that a reaction against your early Marxism or beyond that to other trends in the culture?
When I look back at this considerable distance to that much younger version of myself that I can distantly recognize over the years, part of me is very familiar and feels quite contemporary. There's another part that feels very remote. The part that's familiar has to do with my then core commitments to civil rights, my opposition to the war in Vietnam. I thought the war was a disastrous mistake. I was an ardent supporter of civil rights in the South and in the country generally. And all of those convictions have remained very much a part of my intellectual and moral armature. But I was also a wild-eyed theoretician. I wanted my commitments to all fit together into a neat single package and to be explained by one overarching, rigorous, transparent system of belief. And for a while, I thought that Marx did the job. And when I began to lose faith in Marx, I turned to Max Weber, another very grand theorist, in the hopes that I would find what I was looking for there. And I was eventually disappointed in that respect, too. But over time, and especially after I had begun my study of law and then became a teacher of law, my confidence in the power of abstract reason to construct neat, syllogistic arrangements that will put every principle and every idea in its orderly place. My conviction that reason could do that softened, and then it, I wouldn't say vanished, but it attenuated dramatically. About the same time, I began to read Edmund Burke, who had not been a figure well known to me before. And Burke, in his famous book on the French Revolution, but in his other writings as well, attacks what he calls the political metaphysicians, who believe that theory can be substituted for prudence and practical wisdom, for good judgment and common sense in the work of politics and of law, for that matter. And so I came to see and and eventually to believe very deeply that in politics and in law, it's judgment, prudence, good sense, integrity, virtues of character that matter, and not the abstract philosophical virtues of comprehensiveness, transparency, and logical perfection. And so I moved away from Marx, but not from my belief that we have an unfinished agenda where civil rights is concerned, or that our foreign misadventures beginning with Vietnam have been terrible for the soul of my beleaguered country.
Well, your skepticism about this key to all mythologies, or whatever we want to call it, is certainly at odds with certain trends in academia right now. And one of the things that you talk about in your book, The Assault on Excellence, on American Excellence, is your irritation, perhaps that there should be a stronger word than that, for the 2016 decision at Yale to change the title of the Master of College, because there are colleges at Yale and students live in colleges within the university. And traditionally, the master of the college is somebody who is a venerable scholar and is also sort of in charge of the college programming and so forth. The change from master of college to head of college. And this incensed you, I think I can rightly say. And you write at length about the idiocy, as you see it, of changing that title. Could you talk about that? And was it a very significant moment for you in terms of how you began to think about the higher education and so forth?
The particular decision to which you refer was in itself trivial, risible, I would say, and nothing that deserved the amount of attention and passion that I ended up devoting to it. I mean, what could be more harmless than the master of one of Yale's residential colleges declaring that he no longer wished to be called a master because it carried offensive overtones of patriarchal domination, of plantation, enslavement, and all of the rest. And I thought, how ridiculous. The word doesn't carry any of those implications in this context. But as I started to think about it, it struck me that that very small adjustment in nomenclature reflected a very widespread and aggressive campaign to introduce the spirit and practice of a far-reaching egalitarianism into my college, Yale College, but into colleges and universities across the country, and indeed all institutions of higher culture. And that thought led to another, which was that these institutions, Yale among them, but it's only one of a very great number, are elite institutions. They admit only a few. They are devoted to the study of different disciplines at the highest level of advancement, to the cultivation of the human spirit and the human mind. And those ambitions sit awkwardly in a democratic culture which is committed to the principle of equality for all. I believe in that principle as it applies to the wider society. I don't believe in it as it applies to colleges, universities, museums, theater companies, orchestras, opera houses, and the rest. These are institutions that, by their very nature, are devoted to the pursuit and preservation and broadcasting of what we call higher culture. That led to an obvious question, which I'm certainly not the first to have thought about, namely, what is the place in a democratic society like ours of institutions devoted to cultivation, refinement, and the advancement of the human spirit, to the ideal of excellence in all of its various domains and dimensions? And I do think that democracy and excellence can be made to cohabit peacefully, that it is not a contradiction in terms to say that our democracy incorporates institutions devoted to excellence. But I've had to go back to scratch and try to think all of that through from the beginning again in response to the tidal wave of egalitarianism, of what is sometimes called woke progressivism, that insists that the whole realm of higher culture be leveled down and flattened out.
You make a distinction in your book between a hierarchy of skills and an aristocracy of excellence, which is of character, perhaps, or values, or judgment, or understanding. And you say the one is embraced in our society, it's measurable. The other is not. But when you talk about an aristocracy, you immediately also are liable to alienate many people in a way that when you talk about a hierarchy of skills, you won't. Could you address this notion of aristocracy, which you use a lot in your book, The Assault on American Excellence?
Everyone in my family warned me strenuously against the use of that word. They said, you're asking for trouble, find a substitute. And the more they urged me not to use it, the more determined I was to do so. And I might say in the book, I perhaps used it in an overly aggressive, countercultural way as a tool of resistance against what seems to me some of the very bad features of woke progressivism. It's a word, by the way, that all or nearly all of our founders used with ease and comfort. As you said, we have no difficulty with the concept of expertise. You study biology or mathematics, learn French, or do any one or become an auto mechanic.
You can measure how somebody does in sports. Yeah. Someone wins and someone loses, someone's faster than someone else. Yeah.
All of this is true. We feel no embarrassment declaring some to be further advanced, more expert, more excellent within their field of expertise than others. Distinction is what it's all about. It's the name of the game. But as you say, in the fields that we're talking about now, it's possible to define with some precision what constitutes advancement and to measure high achievement. What about a student of the humanities who sets out to study the civilization of the West with the aim of becoming a more cultured person, of becoming a more refined human being whose capacity for enjoying the beauty of works of art and the truth of philosophical arguments is increased or enhanced? You can, of course, describe that as a kind of expertise, but defining it in that way demeans it. It belittles it. What my imaginary young person is after, really, is an enlargement of her soul. She wants to grow spiritually. She wants to be a larger human being, to be more fulfilled as a human being. And that's not a kind of expertise that we can set alongside all of the others. It's something altogether different.
That used to be the goal of a college education, but I do not think it is any longer, even at the most elite institutions. Would you agree with me?
Regrettably, yes, but there are points of light here and there and pockets of resistance.
I want to ask you another question, not disconnected from that. I interviewed the Harvard philosopher Michael Sandel about his book, The Tyranny of Merit, and he argues that in America we've succumbed to a system of inherited privilege, and this notion of merit reflects that, and it has contributed to the increasing economic and intellectual divide in this country. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that thesis.
Yes. Well, I've read the book. Michael Sandel is a very dear friend of mine. We've spoken about the topic. We've argued about it. I agree with Michael up to the 50-yard line, metaphor speaking. Admission to our elite institutions has become more and more competitive and is determined to an increasing and disturbing degree by pre-application life chances. So if you're born into a family with resources that cares about education and sends you to the proper secondary school, you've got a much better chance of getting into Yale or Princeton or Harvard or wherever. And that needs to be addressed. It needs to be corrected. We're out of whack in that respect. But I continue to believe, and I don't think Michael would disagree with me, that one of the central and abiding responsibilities of our colleges and universities is to introduce students to the unfettered life of the mind, of the spirit, and to give them a chance to explore some of the possibilities for intellectual and emotional and spiritual cultivation and refinement and development. And there will be inevitably in that pursuit grades of achievement as there are in any other. And that marks a hierarchy. I call it an aristocracy of the spirit. I don't find anything embarrassing or shameful about that. I do worry, as Michael does, that fewer and fewer young people who are not the beneficiaries of great privilege and wealth are shut out from the chance to taste the pleasures of the life of the spirit.
Life of the mind, of the free play of ideas. I agree with you. Just to switch gears, because we're almost out of time, I want to talk about your parents' religious background. Your father, as you mentioned, was trained as a rabbi, so he was Jewish. Your mother was from a fundamentalist Christian background, and they both became committed atheists. And you were raised more or less within atheism. And yet, it seems to me, starting with your early Marxism, that you were always searching for a belief system, so to speak. Well, you have two books that deal with theology, your Confessions of a Born-Again Pagan. In it, you combine classical philosophy with Abrahamic religious ideas and create this amalgam that I think is very interesting. And I wonder what you say when people say, well, you've created a God that suits you, a recipe that, can you do that? And to what extent is that cheating?
I would say the recipe suits me very much, but I would disclaim authorship. I didn't invent it. This is Spinoza's invention, my favorite philosopher, and the one on whom in Confessions of a Born-Again Pagan I rely more heavily than any other. But back to your first observation or question, it's so interesting. The farther on you get in life, the better able you are to see it with a measure of detachment, to see the enduring themes and connections and preoccupations that connect your younger and older selves. And that's how I feel about my passionate interest in religion. I would say, summarizing perhaps the whole of a lifetime of endeavor, my extravagance remains, but I have transferred it from the field of politics to the field of religion or theology.
Do you ever think that you're writing an extended book, that your whole career as a writer has involved, but whether your books are continuations of each other in that same way, and when you look at them, you stand back and look at what you've written?
It's such an odd thing to look back and see that all along you've been guided by a continuing, durable preoccupation or set of questions which have given you a point of departure, even if you haven't noticed it, that comes back again and again and again. And as I've labored with these issues, my thinking has changed, of course, but I would describe it not so much as a series of fresh departures, but of refinements and reformulations, which have brought me closer and closer and closer to the self that I am.
Yes, that's the great George Eliot. Each of us has his own center of self.
Yes.
Where the lights and shadows fall with a certain difference. And I have many more things I would love to talk to you about. Perhaps one day we could sit down over coffee or a martini and talk about them. But I want to thank you for a great interview.
Thank you, Paul.
And I want to thank our audience for joining us today on the Civil Discourse.